Hello, fellow canners, and welcome back to Grab Your Jars. Thank you for joining me today. I am going to be canning tomatoes. A lot of people really like to grow tomatoes and really enjoy canning them, so I thought I'd share with you on how to do it. I will walk you through the supplies you're going to need and then walk you through the process. But here we go. Have fun. Again, we're canning tomatoes today, and so I'm going to go through the supplies that you'll need. First of all and foremost, you will need your boiling bathwater canner here. You want any kind of a big pot that you can fit jars in that will allow you to have at least an inch of water over the top of the jars. And then you'd like to have some kind of a rack in the bottom of your pot. If you don't have a rack, you can use a towel that's folded up on the bottom. So you don't have to go out and buy yourself a canner or anything like that. You can start with just putting a towel on the bottom. So you will need your boiling bathwater pot. You will need to have another pot that you're going to have to dump your tomatoes in and then pull them back out and put them into cold water. I like to use a big steamer pot like this. It makes that process very easy. If you have a large steamer pot, use this. You're also going to need to have another pot or two of boiling water on the stove because you will be putting boiling water into the jars along with your tomatoes. Of course, I have my jars already washed and I've checked them all to make sure they don't have any nicks or anything in them. I have washed my screw bands and those are ready to go. I've washed all my lids, those are ready to go. You'll need to have at least one jar lifter, and I like to have two because I like to take them out two at a time. And you can use a funnel, and as always I say I use my funnel for every single canning project that I do, so a funnel is really handy to have. You'll probably want a measuring cup or a pot, a small pot. You will need to have a non-metal, I like to use this skinny little spatula, but some kind of non-metal item that you can put in the jars to get rid of air bubbles. Tomatoes tend to have a reaction with metal, so you want to use something that's non-metallic. And then I do have this amazing little lid lifter that I take my lids out of my hot water and put them on my jars with. Of course, I have my Care canning book here that's going to tell me how long to process my jars. And I have my tomatoes. So these are the supplies you're going to need to can tomatoes. I have 3 pots on my stove. I have that spaghetti large steamer type pot on the right that I'm going to be putting my tomatoes into to get the skins off. And then I have 2 pots of boiling water on the left, so I know I'm going to need at least 7 quarts of water to go over my tomatoes. And then I'm also going to need some boiling water for my lids. So I always just put a couple pots on the stove for boiling water. I'd rather have too much water available than not enough and have to wait for more water to boil. While I'm waiting for my water to boil, I'm filling one of my sinks full of cold water, and then I'm also going to put some ice in there just so it's really cold, because when you take your tomatoes out or off of the stove, you want to put them in cold water to kind of stop their cooking process. I also have a couple knives ready. I have a small one so that I can help slip the skins off my tomatoes. And because I like to dice my tomatoes, I've got a larger knife ready for that as well, and my cutting board. The only thing I'm forgetting right now is my apron, and I'm going to go get that. I drove over to an organic farm yesterday and picked up some tomatoes. We do grow tomatoes, but not nearly enough in my yard for the kind of tomato quantity that I like to work with. So I drove over, picked up some tomatoes. Now, when I first get my box of tomatoes, I'm going to go through these because not every tomato is ready to be canned today. So I'm going to go through here and start picking out tomatoes. Now, obviously, if you're looking at these, you're going to know that this one is not ready, and it's also very firm. So I'm going to set that one aside in a different box and check this one. Now, this one has a little bit of give in it. It's got a nice deep red color. This is ready. I'm going to put this over in this pile. So I'm going to go through this whole box and do that. And If you have a hard time discerning the difference in the colors, close your eyes and just feel the tomatoes. This one feels ready. This one feels firm. This one feels right on the edge, so I'm going to wait a day. This one is rotted on the bottom, so I'm going to look at this and I'm going to decide, well, is there enough of this worth saving to go ahead and process? And yeah, I could save at least half of this tomato that is not soft and is not gross. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that. Now there are some, here's a good example. This tomato is soft and squishy all the way through. It doesn't look as bad as the last one, but it just feels nasty. I don't want to process this because it's just going to turn into mush if I try. The end of this that's white, this is just called bottom end rot, and it's pretty common with tomatoes. These are organic, so I'm not expecting perfection. So again, if you have any questions about how to pick your tomatoes and choose which ones, this one, again, it's pretty soft all the way through. I'm going to put this in my compost pile. So if you have any questions about tomatoes and which ones to use, which ones not to use, put them in the comments and I'll get back with you. So, when I'm making tomatoes, I like to work with about 7 quarts worth of tomatoes because that's all I can fit in my canner. And I don't like to have tomatoes just sitting around waiting. So, since they told me that 3 pounds of tomatoes makes 1 quart of tomatoes that I'm going to can, I've actually measured out. You don't have to do this. I just am doing this to show you the quantity. I measured out 21 pounds of tomatoes. 3 times 7 is 21. So this is about how many tomatoes I should need for 1 batch of 7 quarts. Now, why do I pick quarts instead of pints? When I am using tomatoes, it's usually for chili or spaghetti sauce or tomato sauce or a recipe that calls for diced tomatoes, and they usually call for anywhere from 15 to 30 ounces of diced tomatoes or stewed tomatoes. So I like to can my tomatoes in quarts. It's up to you what you want to do. I'm curious to see if 3 pounds really does make 1 quart, so I have actually weighed out 3 pounds of tomatoes that I'm going to start with. So I wanted to point one thing out. I actually have my boiling bathwater canner out on my outdoor stove that I have out there, my propane stove. So when I say that you need a couple of pots of boiling water back here in the back, really if you have a big enough pot, you really only need 1 so that you have room for your pressure canner, you have a burner for your tomato pot, and then you have a burner for boiling water. That would actually be sufficient, but because I do have a stove outside, I'm going to utilize that. Alright, now my pot is finally at a good rolling boil. I'm just going to go ahead and drop my tomatoes in here. Well, I'm going to drop them easily so I don't get splashed back because that'll hurt. And I'm putting all of this 3 pounds of tomatoes that I wanted to test in here. And they say, you know, anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and just put them in here for 30 seconds. Bam. I'm bringing my tomatoes out of my pot after 30 seconds. I like to kind of stick a bowl under it. And then I'm going to carry this over to my sink and put it in my ice cold water. Drop my tomatoes in my ice cold water. I'm going to give them just a minute to cool off because otherwise they're going to be too hot to work with. Take my tomato out of the sink. You can see the skins are already slipping off. And I'm just going to kind of peel it off. If they haven't started to peel, you can put a little slit in them and they should just peel right off. I'll cut off anything that doesn't look good at this point. This one doesn't have a slit, so I'm just going to put a little slit in it, peel it off. If your tomatoes are really underripe, this will be a lot more difficult process. You can still do it. It'll just take you a little bit more time. You'll have to work at it. I'm going to finish these up and then we'll see if this is 1 quart. This one doesn't have a slit, so I was going to show you up close. I'm just going to go ahead and put a slit in it. And then it just kind of slides right off. Now there is a little rottenness down there, and I'm just going to cut that rottenness right out. And then I'll add this to my others. Now I'm actually going to take my knife and just cut the hole right out of here. Or a big hole in the middle. And I'm going to go do that with all my tomatoes. When I'm done with these, at that point, I can just put these tomatoes in my jars whole. If I just want stewed tomatoes, I can have them, I can quarter them, or in my case, I like to dice them. So that's what I'm going to do. And then I just dice my tomatoes. And these are ready to go in my jar. There you have it. I have my 3 pounds of tomatoes all diced, so let's see how they fit in this quart jar. Tomatoes are not going to expand when you can them, so you can go ahead and fill them to within a 1/2 inch of the top. And I'm not smashing them in there. So I did not use all 3 pounds. Pull my cutting board out so that I have this much tomato left over. So I'm going to say maybe 2.5 pounds for me anyway. So really I only need about 2.5 times 7, that'd be 14, 15, 16, 17 pounds of tomatoes should give me my 7 quarts to work with in my pot. I'm going to go ahead and put another batch of tomatoes in my steamer. This is the tomato that ended up with the bottom end rot, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut that whole end right off and just toss that in my junk pile. And then I'll go ahead and take the skin off. So if you get some with that bottom end rot and want to try and save part of your tomato, you absolutely can. It just depends on how firm the rest of the tomato is. And this was a really nice firm tomato on the other end, so I'm going to salvage it. Go ahead and use it. If it's not something you'd put in your mouth, don't can it. This is another tomato with tomato end rot. But this rot has actually kind of permeated the tomato. I'm not using it. I'm not going to try and salvage it, and I'm going to put it in my compost pile. When you're cutting the stem out, you just want to make sure you get that yellow chunk out, because that can be kind of tough when you're doing your tomatoes. Now, because I've been doing this for a long time and I kind of know how this goes, I kind of keep my process going so that I've got tomatoes cooling in here while I'm cutting and slicing and dicing here. Since not everybody likes the diced tomatoes like I do, I wanted to save enough tomatoes here that I've processed already to show you guys what a jar of stewed tomatoes can look like. So I left these whole, and I'm just going to go ahead and start putting tomatoes in. And I do try and pack these in pretty well. That's pretty full. Packed pretty well. I could maybe, if I wanted to, put another small one on top. And there we go. It's packed pretty tightly in there. Stewed tomatoes. Now I'm still going to be putting boiling water over the top of this, and it won't take a whole lot of water because it is pretty packed, and so it will be processing in its own juices and some water. I have my 7 quarts of diced tomatoes and 1 stewed tomato ready to go into my pot. I'm going to, before I put boiling water in here, I'm going to make sure that my canning pot is on a good rolling boil, because I want it boiling very hard when I put these in there. And I'm also going to now put some boiling water on my lids and start getting them nice and hot. And then I'm gonna wash the edges of my jars here. I am putting boiling water over my lids, and I want to make sure they're completely covered. And I'll just set those aside. To get my funnel. Start putting my boiling. Now it's not going to take a whole lot of water in these, so watch them closely. And again, you're going to fill these to within 1/2 inch of the top. I'm going to take a non-metallic spatula and run it around the sides to get any air bubbles out. This will help your tomatoes retain more of their color. This also helps get the water all the way down to the bottom of the jar and lets me determine if I need to put more water in there, whether my jars are full enough or too full. So, go ahead and get this done. I've adjusted the water levels for those jars that I needed to, and now I'm just going to go ahead and take a clean cloth and wash off the rim of my jar. This will ensure that you get a good seal, make sure there's no little particles of food in there. And as soon as I'm done with this, I will be putting my lids on. When you have all your tomatoes in your jars and you're ready to put the lids on, now is the time to put salt in the jar if you want to add salt. It is completely optional. It is not necessary for the canning to work, so it's up to you. I don't use salt in my canning because everybody tends to salt what they're eating, and I don't think it's necessary, so I don't use it. If you were to put salt in, you would want to use a 1/2 teaspoon per pint or a whole teaspoon per quart, and that's according to the Care Canning book. Right, I'm going to put my screw bands on firmly tight. You can see that my pot over here, my boiling bath water, is already at a rolling boil. I'm going to go ahead and put my jars in. Now, these are kind of cool with these racks. You can hang the rack on the edge of your pot and go ahead and put your jars on. So I'm going to have some overflow. That's all right. I'm just not going to burn my feet. As I've said before, this little pot is my favorite. I'm going to go ahead and just take some of that water out. And again, when that gets to a good rolling boil is when I will start timing. And for quart, tomatoes process for 45 minutes. The nice thing about the tomatoes is you don't have to sit here and babysit them. Once they get to a rolling boil, you turn your timer on and you can walk away and do other stuff until they're ready to come out. You don't have to sit here and adjust your heat at all. My timer's gone off. Go ahead and turn my heat off. And I want to get these off the pot right away. Take off my lid, open that away from you. Scooch my rack handles out of the way. Take out my tomatoes. This is common. They like to float. That's cool. That's fine. And you're putting these onto a thick towel or a dish mat, whatever you have that's really nice and thick that they can cool on. Give them a couple inches between jars to have the air circulate around them. I'm going to take my rack out, get it ready for my next batch. Put my lid back on. And while this was processing, I did another batch. And I have one jar left on that one. So I'm going to get this water boiling again. I might have to add a little bit more water to it. And sometimes when you go to take the lid off your pot when they're done, you find that you've just lost jars. Looks like I lost 2 of them out of this 7-quart batch. And Generally, it's because the jars are old. Meh. That makes me sad. After your jars have cooled, I bring them in. I take my screw bands off. I wash my jars with hot soapy water, and I wash the screw bands. I kind of turn my jars upside down when they're drying so water doesn't collect on the lids. And then after they're dry, I write the year on the top. If you need to, you can write diced tomatoes or whatever and write the date. And usually I'll put the month and the year. And then they're ready to go to storage. We are now done with canning tomatoes. Congratulations on making your diced or stewed or whatever kind of tomatoes you decided to do. If you have any questions about how to do this, please put them in the comments below and I will get back to you. If you liked my video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for joining me.